The wind howled against the thin wooden walls of the cabin, carrying with it the scent of rain and rotting leaves. Inside, the fire cracked lazily in the stone hearth, its light stuttering across 5 uneasy faces. The power had gone out an hour ago, just as they'd settled in to tell ghost stories. It seemed fitting at first, a perfect Halloween setup, until the silence between the gusts started to feel too heavy, as if the night itself were listening. "All right," said Sam, leaning closer to the fire. "I'll go first." His voice sounded smaller than usual, swallowed by the darkness pressing against the windows. "You ever hear about the Marsh family?" he asked, glancing at each of them in turn. "They lived in this cabin back in the 70s. Whole family just disappeared one night. No bodies. No footprints. Just the fire still burning and the front door wide open." The others exchanged nervous smiles, unsure whether to laugh or shiver. But as Sam spoke, a faint creak came from the back hallway, slow, deliberate, like a door being eased open. Nobody moved. Outside, the wind died all at once. And in the stillness, a whisper brushed through the dark. "Don't stop, tell it right." Sam froze. His eyes met theirs, pale and wide, as if he'd heard the voice, too. Then he swallowed hard, and continued the story. Even though none of them could remember what words came next, the lake was a dark mirror that night, reflecting nothing but the bruised clouds above it and the faint, flickering glow of lanterns carried by the 5 friends trudging down the dirt path. The air had that late October chill that crept beneath your clothes, turning each breath into mist. They were laughing, or at least pretending to, as the cabin finally came into view at the edge of the trees. It sat crooked on its old foundation, surrounded by overgrown weeds and the soft hum of crickets, looking more like a forgotten memory than a vacation spot. The group had rented it for the long weekend, a place to escape the noise of the city and relive some part of their childhood together, when Halloween meant staying up all night telling scary stories until someone cried. But now, in the deep quiet of the woods, even their laughter felt out of place. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and damp wood. Dust motes drifted lazily through the air, glowing orange in the firelight. They dropped their bags by the couch, popped open a few drinks, and began to settle in. Someone joked about the place being haunted, the way people always do when they're nervous, but no one laughed quite loud enough to sound convincing. The floorboards creaked underfoot like old bones shifting in their sleep. There were faded photographs still hanging on the walls, a family of 4, smiling stiffly beside the lake, and a single rocking chair that moved slightly every time the wind rattled the windows. The first few hours passed in a blur of warmth and nostalgia. They cooked over the fireplace, shared stories of old crushes and high school fights, and argued over whose turn it was to stoke the fire. Yet as the night deepened and the woods outside grew quieter, something began to change. The laughter thinned out. The shadows stretched longer across the cabin floor. Every noise seemed amplified, the drip of melting ice in the sink, the low sigh of the wind against the roof, the occasional pop of the wood in the fire. When someone suggested turning off the lights and sharing ghost stories, the idea seemed natural, inevitable, like the night itself was leading them there. They circled around the fireplace, the light painting their faces in shades of gold and ash. Outside, the lake rippled once under a gust of wind, though none of them noticed. The door shuddered softly in its hinges, as if something had passed by. In the darkness beyond the windows, the trees swayed and whispered among themselves, their branches reaching just close enough to scrape the glass before retreating again. The fire had burned down to a soft, amber glow, and the cabin seemed to breathe along with it, each flicker of light revealing just enough of the room to remind them how small it was. Sam leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "All right," he said, his voice low but steady. "You wanted creepy? Let me tell you about this place." A few heads lifted. The others exchanged curious looks, assuming he was teasing. But Sam didn't smile this time. His eyes lingered on the framed photographs by the wall, the ones of the family they'd all noticed earlier, before he began. Back in 1973, a family lived here. Husband, wife, 2 kids. The Marshes. Locals said they were quiet, polite, didn't talk much to anyone. Then one Halloween night, the husband ran into town, saying his wife was acting strange, talking to people who weren't there. By the time he got back with help, the cabin was empty. Door wide open. Dinner still on the table. No one interrupted. The only sound was the faint hiss of a log collapsing into ash. Sam's tone changed as he went on, lower now, almost reluctant, as though he were reciting something he'd read long ago but couldn't quite remember where. The sheriff found footprints around the lake, he continued, but they weren't heading away from the cabin. They were circling it. Over and over, like someone had been walking around in the dark for hours. A chill moved through the room, quiet but unmistakable. The storm outside had stilled, and the air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. As Sam described how the search party found the Marsh's youngest child's shoes by the lake's edge, placed side by side, perfectly, someone shifted uncomfortably on the couch. The wind pressed a soft moan through the chimney, and for a heartbeat, the crackling of the fire seemed to form words that none of them could quite make out. Sam's gaze flickered toward the hallway that led to the back rooms. Some say the family never left, he murmured. That they still walk these woods when the lake's calm enough to see your reflection. The silence that followed felt alive, as though the story itself had changed the air around them. The photographs on the wall looked different now, less like pictures and more like open windows into something still waiting to be noticed. Sam stopped talking, his expression tight, as if something about his own words unsettled him. The fire hissed again, a spark jumping from the logs, and for just a second, one of the shadows on the far wall seemed to move even though no one had. The moment Sam's story faded into silence, the room seemed to hold its breath. For a while, no one moved. Then, somewhere deep in the cabin, there came a slow, rhythmic creak, the unmistakable sound of a floorboard bending under weight. Everyone turned toward the hallway, expecting to see someone standing there, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the faint circle of firelight. Probably the wind, Jenna whispered, though her voice trembled just enough to betray her doubt. The wind, however, had died completely. Even the trees outside were still, frozen in a quiet that felt too deliberate. Sam gave a nervous laugh, brushing it off, but the sound was strained. He tried to continue the story, picking up where he'd left off about the search party and the lake, yet every few sentences, another sound answered him, a faint tap from the wall, a soft scrape against the windowpane, the tiniest echo of something shifting in the next room. At first, they thought it was just their imaginations feeding on fear. But then came the whisper, faint, drawn out, and eerily similar to the wind's sigh, except this time it seemed to shape a word. None of them could tell what it said, only that it came from the same direction as the hallway. Sam's voice faltered. He stared into the dark, his eyes narrowing, as though he were listening for something only he could hear. "Do you guys smell that?" he asked suddenly. The air had changed, a faint, sweet scent had crept into the room, like wet earth after rain mixed with something older, almost metallic. The fire flickered violently, sending shadows crawling up the walls like black tendrils. Jenna reached for her phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on, not even a faint glow. The others tried theirs, each one dead despite being charged earlier. Sam looked back toward the hallway again, frowning, then whispered, "That wasn't part of the story." The others didn't understand what he meant, not at first, but the unease spreading through the room was unmistakable. Every sound he described seemed to repeat itself, as if the story were echoing into reality one line at a time. When he mentioned the footsteps circling the cabin, the floor creaked again, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the walls. No one dared speak. The fire sputtered once more, casting their faces in brief flashes of orange and shadow. Then, from the far end of the hallway, came the faint, deliberate click of a door latch turning, followed by the unmistakable sound of a child's laugh, distant yet close enough to make the air feel colder. Sam's hands were trembling now, though he tried to hide it by pressing them together in front of the fire. His voice had changed, softer, almost hollow, as if something inside him was speaking through him rather than from him. The others watched, silent and wide-eyed, realizing that the story had taken on a life of its own. The details were becoming too specific, too vivid, far beyond what anyone could improvise. He spoke of how the Marsh family's father had heard voices in the walls, how the mother had begun writing names on the windows in the middle of the night, names no one recognized. As he described it, the faint outline of a handprint began to fog up on the cabin's nearest window, forming slowly, deliberately, before fading away again. No one dared to move. Jenna whispered his name, but Sam didn't answer. His eyes had lost focus, staring somewhere just past them, into the flames. The shadows on the wall swayed as if caught in a silent rhythm, moving to the cadence of his words. Every time he mentioned something, the sound of knocking, the smell of smoke, the crying of a child, those very things seemed to stir faintly around them. It was no longer storytelling, it was invocation. The room was responding to him. The story wasn't being told, it was being remembered by something that had been waiting to hear it again. The air grew heavier, thick enough to feel with each breath. A faint whisper threaded through the crackle of the fire, echoing Sam's words a beat too late, like a second voice repeating him in a near-perfect imitation. The others exchanged panicked glances, but Sam kept talking, his tone flattening into a distant monotone. His eyes reflected the firelight, but there was no recognition in them. "She said they're still here," he murmured. "She said they never left the lake." The words didn't sound like his own. His lips moved, but the cadence was strange, slow, drawn out, unfamiliar. Then, without warning, every candle and lantern flickered at once, their flames bending sharply toward him as if drawn by a breath. The sound of the wind returned, but this time it wasn't from outside. It came from within the cabin, circling them, whispering through the walls in a dozen overlapping voices that rose and fell with each crack of the fire. Sam's voice broke mid-sentence. His head tilted slightly to the side, and for a brief moment, he smiled, but the expression didn't belong to him. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The wind had died again, but the whispers hadn't. They hung in the air like echoes trapped between walls, faint but layered, too many to count, too soft to understand. The fire dimmed to a deep, pulsing glow, and the room seemed smaller somehow, as if the shadows were closing in. Sam sat motionless, staring into nothing, his lips slightly parted as though he was still listening to someone the others couldn't hear. Then, all at once, he blinked and looked around the room, confusion flickering across his face. "What happened?" he whispered, his voice raw, distant. But no one could answer. Jenna pointed toward the window, her face pale. Outside, the reflection of the cabin shimmered on the lake's black surface, but there was something wrong with it. 5 figures were sitting by the fire inside, yet in the reflection, there were 6. A faint knock sounded from the hallway. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Then silence. The friends froze, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting to the shadows stretching along the wooden floorboards. The knock came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable creak of a footstep. Sam stood, though his movements seemed uncertain, like he wasn't entirely in control. He turned toward the dark hall, his voice a hoarse whisper. "They're not gone. They're never gone." The words weren't meant for his friends, they sounded like an answer to something unseen. The fire flared suddenly, throwing bright light across the room, and in that instant, something shifted in the reflection on the lake. The 6th figure was standing now, closer to the window, its shape distorted, its head tilted as though watching them. The glass began to fog from the inside, letters forming one by one until a single word appeared: "Stay." Jenna screamed, the sound shattering the spell for a moment, and they all stumbled backward. The door rattled violently against its frame, the windows trembled, and from the hallway came the heavy, dragging sound of something moving closer, slow and uneven, like feet that had forgotten how to walk. Sam's voice returned, but it wasn't his own anymore. It carried a depth, an echo that didn't belong to any living thing. "You called them back," it said, though his lips barely moved. "You told their story, and now they're listening." The fire flickered one last time before extinguishing completely, plunging the cabin into a suffocating darkness so complete that no one could tell if their eyes were open or closed, or if the breath they felt on their necks belonged to something standing behind them. The darkness held them for what felt like forever, thick and absolute, pressing against their skin like a living thing. No one dared to move. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and wet earth, and somewhere within that silence came the faint sound of breathing, not theirs, but deeper, slower, just beyond where the fire had been. When the first flicker of light returned, it wasn't from the hearth but from the dying embers that glowed faintly on the floor, revealing shapes where there should have been none. Shadows moved without source or reason, sliding across the walls as if the firelight was being controlled by unseen hands. The friends clung to each other, too afraid to speak. Then Sam stepped forward. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was something wrong in the way he spoke. "They're here," he whispered. "They've been waiting for someone to remember." The others tried to stop him, to pull him back, but he moved as if drawn by invisible strings toward the window. Outside, the lake was still unnaturally still, and in its reflection, the sixth figure was closer now, its outline clearer. It looked human but wasn't. Its head turned slowly, the movement deliberate, until its empty gaze aligned perfectly with Sam's. The whispering began again, a chorus of overlapping voices, each word indistinct yet all carrying the same cold familiarity, as if the cabin itself had found its voice. The walls groaned, the floorboards shuddered beneath their feet, and dust fell from the ceiling like ash. The air temperature dropped suddenly, their breaths visible even in the dark. Then came the sound, faint, rhythmic, like something dragging across the floor in the hallway. It grew louder, closer, until it stopped right behind the closed door. No one breathed. The doorknob turned slowly, metal scraping against metal, then stilled halfway. A whisper slid through the crack, low and pleading, "Let us in." The words came with a childlike cadence, trembling but insistent. Sam turned toward the sound, his expression distant, almost peaceful. "They just want to finish the story," he said, and the others watched in horror as his shadow on the wall began to separate from him, pulling free like smoke rising from a flame. The door creaked open by itself, revealing only darkness beyond, yet the faint outline of figures moved inside it, small, pale, and waiting. The wind outside rose again, howling through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter that didn't sound entirely human. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the cabin until it no longer sounded like laughter at all but something twisted, strained, as though dozens of voices were trying to mimic joy and failing. The sound came from everywhere, the walls, the floor, even the roof, making it impossible to tell where it began or ended. The group stumbled back, clutching one another, their eyes darting toward the open doorway. The darkness beyond it rippled faintly, like water disturbed by movement beneath the surface. Then came the footsteps, slow and deliberate, accompanied by a faint dragging sound that scraped against the wooden planks. A figure began to take shape at the edge of the light, small, fragile, but its movements were wrong, its limbs bending just slightly the wrong way, as though the idea of walking had been remembered but not perfected. Jenna whispered Sam's name again, her voice trembling, but he didn't answer. He stood near the fireplace, eyes fixed on the figure as though caught in some silent recognition. "It's the boy," he murmured, voice cracking. "The one from the story." The others froze. The childlike shape tilted its head, its outline flickering between shadow and substance, and then, without sound, it raised one arm and pointed directly at Sam. The fire flared violently, casting the cabin into blinding light for a moment before dying again, leaving behind the acrid scent of smoke and burnt wood. When their eyes adjusted, the figure was gone, but the door had slammed shut, and the whispering had started anew, softer this time, circling them like a secret past between unseen mouths. The friends began shouting, calling Sam's name, but the more they spoke, the less their voices sounded like their own. Words distorted, stretched, twisted into something unrecognizable. The whispering grew faster, louder, until it blended into a single low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. The photographs on the walls began to tremble, and one by one, they fell, glass shattering across the floor. Beneath each fallen frame, a faint word had been etched into the wall, names none of them recognized. Sam moved toward one of the markings, his eyes wide with something between fear and fascination. "They're writing themselves back in," he whispered. The light from the dying embers illuminated the faint reflection of the lake through the window once more. But this time, the reflection wasn't of the cabin. It was of the lake itself, rippling gently, with 5 dark figures standing at its edge, staring back toward them, perfectly still, perfectly silent, as if waiting for the final part of the story to be told. The reflection on the lake began to shimmer, the surface moving though no wind stirred the trees. The 5 figures standing within it seemed to shift closer, their outlines sharpening, their movements too fluid for anything human. Inside the cabin, the air thickened, filled with a deep, vibrating hum that resonated through the walls and floor. The group huddled together near the dead fire, their faces pale and slick with sweat, listening as the whispers returned, louder now, layered, carrying fragments of words that made no sense and yet felt horribly familiar. Sam was standing apart from them, closer to the window, his expression blank. His reflection didn't match his movements anymore. When he turned his head, the version of him in the glass stayed still for a heartbeat too long before following. Jenna tried to reach him, her hand shaking as she stretched it toward his shoulder, but before she could touch him, the sound of splintering would echoed through the room. One of the back doors had burst open on its own, revealing nothing but the forest beyond. The trees were perfectly still, black silhouettes against a faint grey sky, but between them, pale figures flickered there for an instant, gone the next. Then came the sound of water dripping, though there was no leak, no rain. It grew louder, a steady rhythm that seemed to come from the walls themselves, until they realized the dark stains spreading across the wood weren't shadows. They were handprints, wet and glistening, pressed from the inside out. Sam turned back toward them, his voice soft, almost pleading. "They just want to come home," he said. But it wasn't his tone, it was too calm, too detached. His eyes reflected the faint light in a way that made them seem hollow, empty of anything human. Behind him, the window fogged over again, and a single word began to form, slow and deliberate, open. The friends backed away, but Sam didn't move. He lifted his hand, mirroring the gesture of the figures in the lake, pressing his palm to the glass. The moment he did, a crack split the window from corner to corner, the sound sharp and ringing. The reflection rippled violently, the figures within it now moving as if clawing against the surface, desperate to break through. The walls of the cabin trembled, dust raining down from the ceiling, and the lights of the lanterns flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging everything into darkness as the sound of shattering glass filled the air. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the cabin, sharp and final, followed by an unnatural silence that seemed to swallow even the air itself. The friends froze where they stood, every nerve alive with the instinct to run, yet their legs refused to move. The window where Sam had stood was gone, replaced by an empty, jagged frame through which the night bled in black and endless. Cold air swept through the room, carrying with it the faint smell of the lake, that heavy, metallic tang of water long still. Sam was no longer there. His outline had vanished into the dark as if pulled through the glass itself. For a few seconds, no one made a sound, until Jenna screamed his name, the word breaking the stillness like a stone through ice. The others rushed to the window, their breath fogging the air, but outside there was nothing except the faint ripple of water and the trembling reflection of the cabin lights that no longer burned. Then, from somewhere beyond the lake, came a low hum, the same one they'd heard before, but now it was louder, closer, vibrating through their chests. The reflection on the water shimmered again, revealing not 5, but 6 figures standing on the shore, perfectly still, perfectly mirrored, their faces indistinct yet watching. The friends stumbled back from the window, their panic growing with every passing second. They could hear footsteps again, faint but steady, circling the cabin from the outside, just like in Sam's story. Each step seemed to drag across wet ground, leaving behind a trail of muffled echoes that crept closer until they reached the porch. A hand appeared on the other side of the broken glass, pale, dripping with something dark. It pressed against the frame, the fingers curling slightly as if testing the boundary between worlds. Another hand followed, then the faint outline of a face, distorted by shadow and movement, like something trying to form itself out of the reflection. Jenna stumbled backward, tripping over the corner of a fallen chair, her flashlight clattering across the floor. Its beam swung wildly, catching the faces of her friends, eyes wide, mouths trembling, before landing on the window again. The hands were gone, but the glass was no longer broken. It was whole, untouched, as if nothing had ever happened. Except now, in the reflection, Sam was standing among the figures by the lake, motionless, his eyes glinting faintly in the darkness, watching the cabin from the other side. The reflection of Sam standing among the figures on the lake sent a wave of dread through the room, heavier than any of them had ever felt. He wasn't moving, yet his face seemed to shift with every flicker of light, his expression caught somewhere between sorrow and something unrecognizable. The others stared, frozen, unable to look away. Then came the sound, a faint tapping from inside the walls, slow and methodical, like fingernails against wood. The air grew colder, every breath visible, and the smell of damp earth thickened until it was all they could taste. Jenna clutched the flashlight to her chest, her knuckles white, while Mark took an uneasy step toward the window, as if drawn by an unseen pull. "Sam," he whispered, his voice barely more than air. The reflection seemed to lean closer, though Sam's real body was nowhere to be found. The figures behind him began to move, their outlines shifting and merging, their faces hidden in the blur of mist that rose off the lake. Then, without warning, every door in the cabin slammed shut at once. The sound rattled the walls, the floor, even the beams above their heads. The tapping in the walls turned frantic, faster and louder, until it became a chaotic rhythm echoing from every direction. Something was inside, not outside anymore, and it was moving closer. The group pressed together near the center of the room, too terrified to speak. The old rocking chair by the fireplace began to sway on its own, slow at first, then faster, until it knocked against the wall with each motion. The fire pit, cold and lifeless moments ago, suddenly hissed as smoke curled upward from the ashes, though no flame had returned. Within that smoke, faint shapes began to take form, small, childlike outlines twisting and reaching toward the ceiling before vanishing again. Mark turned toward the door, determined to escape, but the handle burned his hand the instant he touched it, glowing faintly red as if the metal itself were alive. He stumbled back, clutching his palm, and the others could see blister marks already forming. The whispers returned, overlapping now, 1,000 voices speaking in tones too quiet to understand yet too deliberate to ignore. Then they all heard it, one voice, distinct from the rest, coming from the darkness beyond the window. It was Sam. His voice was calm, almost tender. "It's too late to leave," he said, though his lips didn't move in the reflection. "You finished the story." The whispers fell silent, and for a heartbeat, the entire cabin seemed to tilt, the floor trembling as if something beneath it had awakened. The floorboards shuddered beneath them, groaning as though something massive and ancient was stirring under the cabin. Dust fell from the rafters, coating the air in a grey haze that shimmered in the faint light. The friends clung to each other, their hearts pounding so loud they could hear nothing else. Then the whispers returned, not around them this time, but inside their heads, whispering fragments of the story Sam had told, each word echoing in perfect rhythm with their racing pulse. The air thickened until it felt impossible to breathe. The walls began to bulge slightly, the wood stretching as if something were pressing from the other side, something desperate to get through. The tapping grew louder again, closer, until it wasn't a tapping anymore but scratching, a frantic, endless scraping that seemed to crawl through the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Mark tried the window, shoving it open, but it slammed shut on its own with a force that rattled the entire frame. Jenna screamed as the lantern flickered violently, its light pulsing in time with the rhythmic scratching. For an instant, the walls seemed to pulse with the same motion in and out as if the cabin itself was breathing. The temperature dropped again, their breath forming clouds that hung motionless in the air. Then, through the chaos, came a sound that silenced everything, a soft, distant voice humming a lullaby. The melody was simple, haunting, and eerily familiar. It was the same tune that had been playing faintly from Sam's phone earlier that evening when they'd first arrived. Only now, it came from beneath the floor. The humming grew louder, joined by faint, uneven footsteps pacing just under the wooden planks. Then came another sound, a low, heavy knock from beneath them, slow and deliberate, followed by another, and another. The floorboards trembled with each strike, and dust from the ceiling drifted down in lazy spirals. Jenna fell to her knees, pressing her hands against her ears, sobbing for it to stop. But the knocking continued, faster now, until it became a pounding rhythm, shaking the entire cabin. A single word began to form in their minds, whispered by countless unseen voices in unison, remember. The lights died completely. For a moment, the world was nothing but darkness and sound, the pounding, the whispers, the breathing walls. Then, one by one, faint handprints appeared across the floorboards, glowing faintly as if lit from within. The hands were small, hundreds of them, pressing upward through the wood, reaching, clawing, desperate for something that none of them could name. The floor creaked under the growing pressure, the faint light from the glowing handprints pulsing in waves like a heartbeat. The cabin groaned, old beams straining, nails whining against their sockets as though the entire structure wanted to tear itself apart. The air was thick with the smell of soil and decay, and every breath burned in their lungs. Jenna backed away from the center of the room, dragging Mark with her, her voice breaking as she whispered Sam's name again and again, hoping for an answer, but none came. The humming had stopped, replaced by a low moan that seemed to come from below the floorboards, stretching longer and deeper than any human breath. Then, with a sudden crack, one of the planks split open, a jagged hole tearing through the middle of the room. Cold air burst upward, carrying with it a rush of that same metallic scent, stronger now, like the lake had risen beneath them. They stumbled backward as more cracks appeared, the boards splintering outward in a pattern that spread like veins. From the gaps came movement, faint, slow, almost uncertain at first. Fingers emerged from the dark, pale and glistening, clawing at the edges of the broken floor. Dozens of hands followed, all reaching at once, grasping for anything within reach. Mark swung a lantern toward the hole, but the moment the light touched them, the glass shattered, plunging them back into near darkness. The only illumination came from the glowing handprints and the faint light still flickering across the lake outside. The air filled with a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but something close, a chorus of voices blending into a single pitch that made the walls tremble. The hands kept climbing higher, some gripping the floorboards, others pressing flat against the walls as if trying to pull the cabin inward. Jenna could see their faces now, faint and indistinct, forming and dissolving within the darkness like reflections on rippling water. Each one looked the same, hollow eyes, open mouths, frozen expressions of longing. Then she noticed one face among them that was horribly familiar. Sam. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but his eyes pleaded with her, begging her not to run. Mark grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The wood felt alive beneath his hands, vibrating with the same rhythm as the pounding from below. The light from the window flickered one last time, revealing the lake outside boiling violently, waves crashing against the shore without wind, and within those waves, hundreds of faces staring back, waiting for the story to end. The cabin shook harder now, the sound of the pounding beneath them merging with the roar of the unseen waves outside. Dust filled the air, choking them as the walls began to buckle, the floor rising and falling as though something enormous was breathing beneath it. Jenna and Mark clung to each other, screaming over the noise, but their voices were lost in the chaos. The cracks in the floor widened, and from within the gaps, a faint light began to glow, not warm, not golden, but a cold, blue shimmer that pulsed like the heartbeat of something buried alive. The hands that had reached through the boards were retreating now, not vanishing but sinking back into the light, as if drawn toward something deeper, something calling them home. The moaning sound faded into whispers again, hundreds of overlapping voices speaking one phrase over and over, too low to be understood until it became clear, "Join us." Jenna stumbled toward the door, beating against it with her fists until the skin split. The wood didn't move. It didn't even feel like wood anymore, it was colder, smoother, almost breathing under her palms. Mark grabbed a chair and swung it at the window, but the glass rippled like water and absorbed the blow without shattering. His reflection wavered there for a moment, staring back at him, and then it smiled, his own face, but twisted, hollow, eyes black and bottomless. The reflection raised its hand and pressed it against the other side of the glass. Mark froze, watching as his mirrored self began to sink backward, disappearing beneath an invisible surface until the lake appeared again in its place. Jenna turned toward him, shouting, but her voice cut short as the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. Her breath came out in thick clouds, and her tears froze against her cheeks. The light beneath the floor grew brighter, spilling upward in shimmering streams that painted the walls with ghostly color. The whispers rose to a shrill pitch, no longer words but a collective wail. Mark tried to reach for her, but something cold wrapped around his wrist, not a hand, not flesh, but something that felt like the weight of water pressing down. He looked down and saw his reflection mirrored perfectly beneath him, reaching up through the floor, gripping him tightly. Jenna screamed as he was pulled downward, the boards closing around him like liquid. The last thing she saw was his open mouth, the reflection of herself staring back from the water within the wood, as if the lake had found its way inside the cabin. Jenna collapsed to her knees, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and rot, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had just seen. Mark was gone, swallowed whole by the cabin itself, and yet the floor where he had stood looked untouched, smooth and unbroken, as though nothing had ever happened. Her hands trembled violently as she pressed them against the boards, feeling for any sign of warmth or breath, but they were cold, lifeless, and hard as stone. Outside, the The storm had finally stilled, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt wrong, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The light from the lake no longer shimmered. Instead, it was still and dark, reflecting nothing. Only the faint outline of the cabin's window glowed, as if something unseen was watching from within the glass. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the silence around her. She turned toward the door again, hoping, begging that it would open this time, but the handle twisted on its own before she could reach it. The door creaked inward, not with the sound of wood moving, but with the long, wet groan of something organic stretching open. Cold mist rolled in, swirling around her feet and crawling higher until it reached her knees. She could see her own reflection in the mist, distorted, rippling, smiling when she was not. Then, from the fog, a shadow began to take shape, slow and deliberate, a figure bending forward as though stepping out of the lake itself. It was Mark. His clothes dripped with dark water, his skin pale and blue, but his eyes were wrong. They gleamed faintly, like the glow from beneath the floor, and his movements were too slow, too smooth, as if he were floating rather than walking. "Jenna," he whispered, his voice hollow and distant, echoing unnaturally around the room. She backed away, shaking her head, whispering his name as tears streaked her face. He reached out to her, and when his fingers brushed her arm, her skin burned with icy pain. The touch wasn't human, it was the cold of something ancient, something that remembered her. Behind him, the doorway filled with mist, and shapes began to move within it, faces pressing through, one by one, all bearing the same lifeless eyes. Jenna stumbled backward as the room began to tilt, the walls melting into ripples of water. Her reflection fractured across every surface, each image of herself turning to face her, smiling, whispering, beckoning. The cabin's wooden walls faded into the dark shimmer of the lake, and Jenna realized too late that she was no longer inside at all but standing upon the water's surface, surrounded by faces that looked exactly like her own. The surface of the lake was unnaturally still, smooth as glass beneath Jenna's feet, yet she could feel the faint pulse of something alive moving below. The mist around her thickened until she could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but the faces within it remained clear, all variations of herself, each smiling with a serenity that chilled her to the core. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. Her reflection held her there, rippling slightly with every panicked breath she took. The air was heavy and silent, the kind of silence that pressed into her ears and made her heartbeat sound deafening. Slowly, the reflections began to move on their own, walking toward her across the surface of the water, each step sending perfect circles outward that never reached her. She tried to scream, but her voice came out broken, swallowed instantly by the fog. The reflections whispered in unison, their voices overlapping in a hollow echo that seemed to come from inside her head. They spoke her name over and over, not pleading but commanding. With each repetition, she felt her body grow colder, her breath shorter, as if the sound itself was drawing the life from her. Then, one of the reflections broke away from the rest. It stepped forward and tilted its head in perfect imitation of her own movements, but when it smiled, its teeth were black, jagged, and too many to count. Its eyes glowed faintly blue, the same light she had seen under the cabin floor. The water beneath her began to ripple violently now, waves surging outward though there was no wind. Beneath the shifting surface, she saw hands again, hundreds of them, pressing upward, stretching just beneath the thin barrier between her and whatever was below. The reflection that had moved closer reached out a trembling hand, its fingertips grazing the surface of the water where Jenna's reflection should have been. The moment they touched, the lake exploded into motion, dragging her downward with impossible force. She tried to fight, kicking, clawing, but her body moved sluggishly, as if the air itself had turned to liquid. The water engulfed her, freezing and dark, and the last thing she saw before she went under was the reflection's face, her face, watching her sink with calm, glassy eyes. The deeper she fell, the quieter everything became. Light faded completely, replaced by a pulsing blue glow far below. There was no air, no sound, only the slow rhythm of that light, beating like a heart. Shapes drifted past her in the dark bodies, still and suspended, and among them, she recognized Mark's face, his eyes open, lips moving in silence. Then her reflection appeared before her, reaching out once more, whispering something she couldn't hear. The water grew warmer around her, almost comforting, and as she felt her body go still, She realized the reflections weren't trying to haunt her, they were trying to make her one of them.